Hi everybody, my name is Linda Abraham and I am the president of Accepted and the moderator for today's webinar. Welcome to Dominate the GMAT, your three-part game plan for dominating the GMAT. All of you are here because you get it. You understand the importance of the GMAT in the MBA application process, and you are wisely getting information now so that you can quickly start your test prep and be ready to start your application process when the new applications come out. Hat tip to you all. Before we start the presentation, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. Brett may ask a couple of questions during the presentation and ask you to raise your hand in response. You can do so by clicking on the hand icon, two icons underneath the horizontal orange arrow on your control panel. Please raise your hand when you find it. Please click on that icon. Okay, a few more. Let's get a few more hands raised. Please click on that icon. Okay, most of you are finding it. Great. All right, fantastic. Good. As usual, we're looking forward to answering all your questions, and we've set aside time for Q&A. So feel free to enter your questions in the question window, and we'll review the questions submitted and choose those that have the broadest application. If we don't have time to get you to your specific question, we'll be providing several options for you to get your answers at the end of the webinar. Now, a word about our presenter. After graduating from Duke University with a degree in public policy, Brett Etheridge spent 2 years in Madagascar doing community health education with a U.S. Peace Corps. Upon his return to the States, he helped launch a PR marketing firm in Washington, D.C., before heading to business school, where he earned an M.A. in international finance from the University of Denver. While in school, he caught the entrepreneurship bug. In addition to founding Dominate the GMAT, Brett also operates successful nutrition and stock trading businesses. He is a huge Duke basketball fan, an avid tennis player, and a budding CrossFit athlete. Brett is also proud to be an associate member of AGAC, the Association of International Graduate Admissions Consultants. Accepted is delighted to host this webinar for Dominate the GMAT. Brett, the floor, or should I say the mic and screen, are all yours.
Thank you, Linda, and I'm honored to be here with all of you guys today. Thank you, Linda, for hosting me. And I'm excited really just to kind of share my heart and wisdom with you guys over the next hour or so. I don't have an hour's worth of content. I'm going to do my best to leave some time at the end for some questions. You can go ahead and type your questions in the question area as we're going through, and I'll do my best to kind of review those as they're coming in. You know, I had an interesting experience 2 summers ago. I was actually living down in Colombia. My wife and I decided we wanted to go down to Colombia to learn Spanish and salsa dance and just kind of have a life adventure. And it was a lot of fun. So we actually sold a lot of our possessions. We moved down there, and we were living in Bogota. And I was taking Spanish classes. So I would take Spanish classes in the morning and then kind of work or do whatever in the afternoons. And I was in class one day. Actually, class had just gotten out, and this guy walked in. And he was there to pick up his fiancée, who was taking the Spanish classes with me. And he looked at me, and then he kind of stopped, and he did a double take. And then he looked at me again, and he said, "I know you." I said, "I don't think I know you." And he goes, "No. Last night, literally, I was on YouTube, and I watched every one of your free videos on YouTube about how to dominate the GMAT." And it was a very small world. So anyway, it was a lot of fun. We ended up talking, sat down, and had some lunch, and he ended up working with me to help prepare for the GMAT. But he said something interesting, and this is the point of my story. He talked about, he was from London, had a cool British accent and stuff, and he was looking to apply to some of Europe's top business schools, but also some of the top schools in the U.S. And he was telling me how blown away he was by how big of an industry the whole GMAT industry is, the whole preparing for business school, preparing for the GMAT admissions consultants. I mean, it seems like anymore, if you really want that edge, you need to work with people like Linda, and you need to prepare for the GMAT in a very official way. And I was just agreeing with him. And he was a little bit irked by the fact that that's kind of the reality today, but he also acknowledged that really there's no way around it anymore, that if he wanted to have that edge against his peers, he was going to have to do something essentially to keep up with his peers. And like I said, he eventually started working with me. But I applaud you guys for this, because preparing for the GMAT doesn't just happen by chance. No matter how smart you are, you can't just show up on test day and fully expect to get the score that you want to get into some of the top business schools. And so There's absolutely a rhyme and a reason to doing well on the GMAT, and that's the purpose of this webinar. I'm going to share with you 3 strategies, 3 mindsets, 3 things that you should really be focusing on as you start to prepare for the GMAT. Now, just kind of looking ahead a little sneak peek, I am going to be giving some offers at the end, including a discount on my full course, but also 3 free practice tests. You know, one of the things that's so important for you guys is that you're taking full-length practice tests, and I'm going to tell you how you could potentially win one of those 3 free practice tests that I'm going to give away. But why are you here, right? Why are you here spending an hour in your afternoon learning about how to take the GMAT? I love this. I love this graphic. My aspirations to be a Buddhist monk were dashed when I failed the monastic aptitude test, and I chuckle every time I see that. And I think there's a lot of truth in it, right? At the end of the day, first of all, it seems like there's an entrance exam, an AT, an aptitude test for everything, right? There's the GMAT, there's the MCAT for medical school, there's the LSAT for law school, right? And whether you like it or not, you're going to have to do this. You're going to have to take the GMAT if you want to get into business school. And the other reality is that more and more, increasingly, schools are putting increased weight and importance on your GMAT score, and so you want to do well. Now, show of hands, let me go back up here to where I can see you guys raising your hands. And some of you still have your hands raised, so go ahead and click on that little icon again to unraise your hand, just so you've cleared it off. Okay, perfect. How many of you have already taken the GMAT? Okay, Deepak, I see you. A bunch of you guys on this call. I can't call out everybody's names. Actually, not as many as I would have thought. So a few of you have already. Okay, so you guys are here, and you already know some of what I'm going to be, and you can go ahead and lower your hand again. Let me kind of tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to give a broad overview of the GMAT, kind of the format and some of the things that some of you guys are already going to know about, those of you who raised your hand then. But I'm also going to get nitty-gritty. I'm going to show you a really cool strategy later that's going to help you get a better score, right? Because if you've already taken the GMAT, in theory, you're here to learn how to improve your score. And don't worry, I'm going to have some stuff in here for you guys as well. Now, by show of hands then, how many of you, literally this is going to be your first introduction really to kind of what the GMAT is, what's in store for you. You haven't even cracked the book at all. Are any of you guys in that boat? And it's okay if that's it. A couple of you. Let me look. A few of you, more hands going up. Okay, but a smaller percentage. Okay, that's good. And the reality is, and you can lower your hands, the reality is it doesn't matter whether you're starting from scratch or whether you're trying to boost your score. I want to kind of recalibrate your thinking about how to go about this test. Because if you didn't get the score you were looking for the first time, you may have to do things a little bit differently, right? We're all familiar with the famous Einstein quote that says the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So if you've already taken the GMAT, maybe you didn't do as well as you would have wanted to. If you continue to prepare and maybe study and do the things that you did to get that score, why would you expect things to change? And so maybe I'll tell you some things today that'll help shape your thinking a little bit there. All right. For those of you who are brand new to it, obviously the GMAT is it's the entrance exam for business school. It measures your verbal, math, analytical, and writing skills that you have developed over time. Now, that's what they say. The truth is you can still learn some of this stuff. And some of you may not have learned how to ever really effectively analyze an argument, for example. Those are things that we can teach you how to do. Things like reading comprehension, that rests a little bit more on how much reading you've done to date. You have a certain math base that you're going to be working from, but even there, if you have a deficiency in certain math concepts, maybe you're not good at probability or combinatorics, maybe you need to brush off some of those math cobwebs, we can definitely teach that as well. But I think this third bullet point is crucial. And this is where I come from when I'm teaching the GMAT, when I'm working with students. Ultimately, let's just acknowledge right off the bat that the reason you're taking the GMAT is because it's a means to an end. Would you guys agree with that? I mean, I think about this conversation I had with William. Ultimately, he didn't like the fact that he had to enter this big bad industry of the GMAT and take a class and do everything to prepare to get into business school, but he realized that it is today's reality, that if he wanted to get where he wanted to go, he was going to have to play the game. And that's the reality. You're taking the GMAT not because you want to learn a bunch of grammar rules, right? Subject-verb agreement rules and misplaced modifier rules, not because you want to remember how to find the area of a circle or any of those types of things. You're going to have to do some of that stuff, but that's not why you're going to spend $250 to take the GMAT. You're doing it simply because you have to get into business school. And the reason I emphasize this is because that's how I want to then teach the GMAT to you. Your goal is to get right answers. And that's the mindset you want to take into the GMAT. Too often I think people focus on learning all of the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts and things like that without learning efficient strategies and ways of getting right answers, sometimes even if you don't know how to do the relevant math, and I'm going to show you a really cool example of what I'm talking about later in this webinar. Your GMAT score is good for 5 years, so just realize, maybe it's time to study now, get it out of the way, even if you're not going to study or even if you're not going to apply to business school for another year or two. And MBA.com is really the go-to website for you to learn everything kind of about the logistics of registering for the GMAT. Now, let me just introduce you, for those of you who aren't familiar with the GMAT, to the format and what you're in store for. The very first thing you're going to do is you're going to write an essay. You have 30 minutes to write what's called an analysis of an argument essay, and it will receive a separate score from 0 to 6. 0 is you barely even know how to write your name, and 6 is a very well thought out, very fluent, thoughtful analysis, well-constructed, well-written analysis of an argument essay. And then you launch immediately into a second section called integrated reasoning. You also have 30 minutes for that, and that too will receive a separate distinct score from 1 to 8. So now you're an hour into the GMAT, you've taken 2 sections, you will have received 2 separate scores for each of those 2 sections, and then comes the meat and potatoes of the GMAT, right? And I think Linda would back me up on this. This is really the score that matters. We talk all the time to admissions offices, admissions officers, and while they're hoping that the integrated reasoning section, for example, is going to start to carry more and more weight, as of now, it's not quite as important as that 200 to 800 point score, right? That's the score that schools list on their website. Maybe they tell you that their median, like their 80% GMAT range is a 660 or something like that for some of the top schools. And that's the score, right? This is the score that we're shooting for, and a lot of you know what that target score is that you're going for. And it's a compilation of the final 2 sections of the GMAT. The quantitative section, where you have 75 minutes to complete 37 questions and 75 minutes to complete 41 questions.
And by the way,
the quantitative section. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just want to completely agree with you.
And I forgot that you can come off mute. Yeah, and please feel free. I mean, if you know, because Linda's really the expert on the admissions, right? I'm the expert on teaching you how to get a good GMAT score, but for everything admissions related, Linda's the go-to person. But yeah, that's what I've been hearing.
After they get the score. After they get the score.
Exactly. There you go. Now, here's the good news, though, guys, right? So you don't want to completely bomb this, because the other thing, though, is if your essay and integrated reasoning score is completely out of line with your main score, that may throw up some red flags for you. The good news is everything you learn, focusing on learning how to do well on the quantitative and verbal sections, applies to the integrated reasoning section and to the essay, right? The essay, for example, analysis of an argument, is literally everything I would teach you, everything you need to know for the critical reasoning section of the verbal section, right? Because everything you're doing to learn how to analyze an argument and get right answers on critical reasoning is exactly the type of stuff you want to do in essay form up here. So don't waste your time studying the essay. Spend your time learning how to dominate the verbal section, and it will translate. Same thing with integrated reasoning. The content tested in integrated reasoning is the type of stuff you're going to be tested in problem solving, the type of stuff you're going to be tested in data sufficiency, the type of stuff you're going to be tested in reading comprehension and even critical reasoning. It's just that they ask it in a slightly funky way, right? The question types are a little bit weird. All of this to say is I talk about how to study for the GMAT. If you're constructing a game plan, you want to spend most of your time right here in these 2 major sections. All right, I think that's enough of that, especially since most of you have already taken the GMAT, but I hope you found some value there. What I want to do now, though, is I want to give you some value right off the bat, and understanding how the GMAT is scored goes a long way to doing that. So I need a volunteer. Let me go back to where I can see your hands raised. Who is a Price is Right fan? I want somebody raise your hand if you want to be a volunteer and play just a short, easy little game with me, especially if you're a Price is Right fan, but if not, that's okay too. So I need a volunteer. I know you guys know how to raise your hand because I've seen you guys do it before. If not, this is going to be a lot more boring explanation of GMAT scoring. Come on, somebody can be bold.
There is
one.
You got at least one volunteer.
All right, perfect.
Yep.
Abhijit, you're my man. All right. So here's what we're going to do, Abhijit. Go down into the chat area, and let me make sure. Type me a chat. Hi, Abhijit. Can you see my chat down there, Abhijit, in the chat area? If you can, I just want you to respond by typing down in that chat area because I need to see your responses. I'll give you a second. If this doesn't work, I'll go a different direction with explaining this, but hopefully, Abhijit, you can find the chat area and just type a message down in there to me just to confirm that you can hear me and know where we are. Okay. Try it in the question window, Abhijit. Let's see. See if you can send me a question in the chat.
It's showing up. It's showing up in the. He's typing and it's showing up in the question window.
In the question window. Okay. Let me see where that is. Perfect. Okay. You can hear me. Okay. Perfect. Good. Yeah. All right. Good. All right. So here's how the game works, Abhijit. We're good to go. So there's a famous game on The Price is Right called the clock game, and basically the way it works is you're going to have something that you're bidding on, right? Maybe it's a car, maybe it's a whatever it is. You're just trying to bid on that, and you have 30 seconds within which to answer or to find the exact dollar value of what you're bidding on, right? And so maybe the thing's worth $10,000, $10,000 and $10,380, and you're trying to guess that exact amount in under 30 seconds. That's what I want you to do. Here's what you're going to be guessing the exact dollar value of. I have a brand new iPhone 6. I just got it a couple weeks ago, actually, and you know, I know roughly, you probably know roughly what it costs, but I'm going to have the exact dollar amount in my mind, and your job, Abhijit, is to find the exact dollar value of what this is worth in under 30 seconds. And all I'm going to do, every time you make a guess, and I want you to type it in the chat area, every time you make a guess, I'm simply going to say higher or lower, and then you can adjust your guess accordingly. Okay? You good to go? All right. I have the number in my mind. Go ahead and make your first guess. $700, lower. $700, lower. $860, I said lower. Lower, in other words, lower than 700. The actual value is lower than 700, lower than 860. Make your next guess. $650, lower. $500, higher. $550, higher. $600, higher. $630, higher. $655, lower. I think you had already said $650 at one point. Lower. $650, lower. Higher than $640. $645, lower. Almost there. $642, actually you got it. Very good, right on, $642. Good job. Good job, Abhijit. Thank you for your participation. Now, for those of you guys who are kind of listening, what does this have to do with anything? Well, the reality is this is exactly how your GMAT is scored. Right? Let me explain, and it's going to lend itself to some interesting strategies right off the bat, right? The GMAT, as you see on your screen, is what's called a computer adaptive test. And the first aspect of that is the fact that it's a computer-based test. You will be sitting in front of a computer to take the GMAT. But the important aspect of this is the adaptive nature of it. The test will change depending on how you are doing. So let's think about Abhijit's guessing algorithm, right? There was an unknown value of the cost of my iPhone, right? And in fact, it turned out to be $642. But Abhijit didn't know that, so he had to figure that out. So what did you notice about his guessing algorithm? Which, by the way, nice job. I mean, that is the best way to go about it, is exactly what you did. Well, he stabbed in the dark. I think his first guess was 700, right? And then after that, he went way down, like he started up here at 700, and then he went way down to 500, I think. And then he knew he had it blanketed, or maybe he went to 600. And then he had it blanketed, and then he went up to 650, right? And then he went back down. And how much was he changing his guess by in the beginning? A lot, right? And then how much was he changing his guesses by at the end? A small little amount, because he was close to the outcome. And this is exactly the same thing that the GMAT scoring algorithm does. Why? Because it is a computer, right? It has to figure out how good of a GMAT test taker you are in 41 questions, for example, on the verbal section, right? So I'll just kind of change this to the bottom to 41, and let's pretend we're on the verbal section. So how is it going to do that? Let's say eventually you're going to get a 640 on the GMAT. Let's say you're a 640 level GMAT test taker, right? Well, how in the heck is the computer going to figure that out? It has to make a guess about you. And so just like Abhijit took a kind of a stab in the dark and guessed 700 right off the bat, the GMAT too is going to make a guess about you. And it's going to start by assuming you're average. Does that make sense? Without getting ahead of ourselves to teach a little bit of statistics, right? But one of the things you have to know on the GMAT is a little bit of statistics. And if you remember the old bell curve, probability theory, but also kind of this is the mean and standard deviations and so forth, right? Most people, in fact, 68% of people are going to fall within one standard deviation of the mean. Most people are going to be around average. So it makes sense from the GMAT standpoint to assume that you are average as well. So let me go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's what it's going to do. Again, it doesn't know that you're going to be a 640 level test taker yet, but it's going to start by giving you an average level question. But here's the interesting thing. Remember, it adapts, right? If you get it right, it will give you a harder question for question number 2. And not just a little bit harder, a lot harder. It might go up all the way to, say, 560. Why? Well, because it only has 41 questions within which to figure out what you are. It can't give you a 501 level question, then a 502 level question, then a 503 level question. It wouldn't even get all the way up to 460 by the time you ran out of questions. Does that make sense? So just like Abhijit's guessing algorithm, the GMAT does the same thing. It's going to make big swings in the beginning, but then towards the end, smaller and smaller and smaller changes because it's gotten pretty close to your ultimate abilities. Does that make sense? And you're never going to forget this. Now that we played the clock game, you're never going to forget how this works, right? And likewise, though, if you get the first few questions wrong, it sets you up on a wider range, lower trajectory, and then you can eventually work your way up. But again, the swings in your score aren't as big later on in the section as they are early in the section, right? And so here's kind of an example of how it might play out. You might have Louise, who, for example, gets the first 2 questions right and then the second 2 questions wrong. And Andrew gets the first 2 questions wrong and then the next 2 questions right. Who would you rather be, Louise or Andrew? They both got 2 questions right. Andrew got 2 questions right of the first 4. They both got 2 questions wrong of the first 4, but notice their trajectories were different. Louise is a little bit better off after 4 questions than Andrew was, right? Now, let me say this. 41 questions is still plenty of time on the verbal section, 37 questions on the quant section for Andrew to get his score up to his 640. All I'm saying is that if you can start yourself off on a better trajectory, can you see how that might be valuable? And can you see how it's actually worthwhile kind of understanding how the GMAT is scored? Because it also gives you some ideas of what to do at the end of a section. Right? So what strategies does this lend itself to? You know, strategy number 1, I always tell my students, you want to make sure you're not making careless errors early on. So spend a little bit more time on earlier questions. Now, there is a little bit of controversy. I talk with some of my colleagues in other companies, you know, about this. And the reality is that you can undo any gains you make early on in the section if you completely mess up the end of the section, but I'm going to talk about that here in a second. But here's what you don't want to do. You don't want to make careless errors. You don't want to accidentally overlook something. You don't want to rush early on in the section. And if on average you have about 2 minutes per question, maybe it's worth spending 2 minutes and 30 seconds, for example, on some of the first questions just to ensure you're getting them right, double check your answer, do the long division on your scratch paper, take deep breaths because you're probably going to be nervous as soon as the test starts, those types of things, right? Because if you can make sure to do the best you possibly can on the earlier questions, that will serve you well. Does that make sense? But now here's the other thing. What does it mean at the end of the section? Now let me go back a second because I want to show you something. This is where my colleagues are exactly right. Even if you set yourself up on a higher trajectory early on because you spend maybe a little bit of extra time, if you mess up at the end of the section, you can undo that. Why? Because there is a big penalty for leaving questions unanswered. Let's assume you're at the end of the section and you have 3 questions left. You can obviously guess and get those right, and if you do, that's good for you. Obviously, you want those last questions. That could be the difference between a 460, or 640 and a 660. It could be the difference between a 680 and cracking 700. So ideally, you don't sacrifice enough time in the beginning that you run out of time at the end because you want enough time to be able to answer some of the harder questions because that's really where you're going to, get those last few points to get in the upper 600s or 700s if that's what you're shooting for some of the top business schools, obviously. But notice it's not the end of the world if you guess because you're kind of running out of time and get them wrong, right? You might lose 20 points, for example, by getting those last 3 questions wrong, but notice the difference, right? You get 3 questions at the end wrong, your score doesn't go down by as much as it went up just getting the first question right because it was making bigger swings in the beginning. That's what I'm talking about. But here's where there's a problem. If you leave questions unanswered, it's a big-time penalty, maybe twice as much as just getting the questions wrong. So you might lose 40 points, 60 points just by skipping the last question or 2 or 3. So absolutely, let me go back to strategy number 2. If you're running out of time at the end of the section, by all means, guess. You don't want to take those penalties because great that you spent a little extra time in the beginning to get more right answers, but you're going to undo it all at the end of the section. Does that make sense? So you need to do a combination of these strategies. And I'm not talking about spending 4 minutes on earlier questions. It's just not worth it. You do need to employ some guessing strategies to make sure that you're moving on. And at the end of the day, I think the best advice is still, despite what I just taught you, you just want to try to do the best you can on every single question. Don't try to figure out how you're doing. The GMAT does have some experimental questions. In fact, I've heard that as many as 1/6 of the questions on the GMAT are experimental. So there's a chance that you see a question, you think it's easier, maybe you start to panic and think, oh, that must mean I got the last question wrong. Oh, man, I'm never going to make it to business school. Don't start playing mind games because it's just not worth it. Don't try to figure out how you're doing. Just do the best you absolutely can. But towards the end of the section, understand that you may want to cut your losses earlier on if you don't know how to do questions, save time to try to get some of the harder questions right, and absolutely don't leave any questions blank. So, does Does this all make sense? You know, if you guys have questions as they're coming in or as I'm going over any of this stuff, you can go ahead and type them in the questions area. But yeah, so that's a little bit on GMAT scoring, and I wanted to give you guys some real meat and potatoes right off the bat. I mean, this is worth valuable points to you. It's definitely worth, you know, saving yourself 20, maybe even 40 points at the end just by knowing that you shouldn't skip any questions. But definitely understand that if you spend a little bit more time, you can boost your score. All right, now let's get into kind of the 3-part game plan for dominating the GMAT. And I want to frame this by talking about really how you get good at anything. I want you to think about anything that you've done in the past, that you've learned to do in the past. Maybe it's learning an instrument, learning to play the piano or the violin. Maybe it's learning a new language, right? I just went through this down in Colombia, learning Spanish. For me, I have a picture of a golfer up here because I'm a golfer, and years ago I learned how to play golf. Whatever it is that you have learned how to get good at, what does it take? What does it take? What's the process of learning how to really do anything? Well, it starts with learning the how-tos, the content, right? I'll kind of write this. This is like the how-tos. Maybe this is the textbook learning. This is somebody standing with me at a driving range showing me how to hold the club, how to initiate my backswing, how to rotate my shoulders to get the maximum torque on the downswing to hit the ball, how to watch the ball and where I'm supposed to try to make contact with the ball, right? This is all the stuff that they tell you to do. If you're learning an instrument, you got to learn where the different notes are, where to put your fingers on the violin, et cetera, right? But are you immediately good just because somebody tells you the content, tells you what to do? And even if you learn kind of the textbook method of doing things, is that ultimately what makes you good, right? I play the piano a little bit, and I can read notes, but I am very formulaic. I'm terrible to listen to play the piano because I just sound boring. I mean, I basically play the notes that are on the page, and that's about it. I'm not good enough to improvise. I haven't learned strategies about running together maybe some chords to make it a more robust sound and so forth and so on, right? So what's step number 2? You need to learn those strategies. So on the GMAT, let me take this analogy back to the GMAT then. Step 1 is you absolutely have to learn the content. You've got to learn, you know, how to find the area of a circle. You've got to learn subject-verb agreement rules. You've got to learn some of that content. But ultimately, your ability to get, you know, really high score on the GMAT is going to require you to go beyond that, to get right answers even if you don't know how to do the math. By the way, that's possible, right? You need to be in a situation where even if you're not quite sure how to do a certain problem, how can you improve your guessing odds? How can you maybe go at it a different way? How can you maybe even still get a right answer if you're not quite sure what to do? If you see a traditional type of a question, is there maybe a more efficient way to get that right answer? And those are the strategies I'm talking about. Everybody who does well on the GMAT, yeah, they learn a bunch of stuff, but then they get good at actually taking the test. They get good at time management, and that comes down to strategies. And then what's the third component of your game plan? The third part about getting good at anything? It's putting in the hours, right? It's practice, 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 practice. In sports, it's muscle memory. In playing the piano, it's muscle memory. It's just doing it over and over and over again. And the GMAT is the same thing. And so what I want to do now for the next 10 to 15 minutes, I want to unravel this game plan a little bit more, and I want to give you guys kind of what you should be thinking about in terms of learning the content. What strategies should you be thinking about and trying to learn? What should you do in terms of your practice, right? What are resources that are available to you to do each of these things? Does that sound fair? Does that sound like a good plan? Before I dive in, let me just check the question area. Anybody have any questions at this point before I continue moving forward? Pretty clean. I must either be really thorough, or maybe you guys are all checking Facebook and not paying attention. No, I'm gonna assume and trust that I'm doing a good job in giving you guys what you guys are looking for. All right, let's talk about kind of game plan number 1. Part number 1 of dominating the GMAT is the content piece. Like I said, there's no substitute. I can teach you all the strategies in the world. I can show you time management techniques, but if you see a question and you don't even know what the distance, rate, time formula is, and you don't know how to find, you know, how long it takes John to drive to the grocery store at 10 miles an hour, you're going to have a hard time answering that question. And so here's the content that is tested on the GMAT. Basic arithmetic. And this goes beyond just 1 + 1 = 2, but you do have to know things like fractions, how to add, subtract, multiply, divide fractions, percents, decimals, which are just kind of the opposite side of the same coin. It's all expressing relationships. The GMAT loves ratios, so you need to know something about ratios and how to solve ratio questions. Averages, and particularly weighted averages, right? They love the weighted averages. Statistics, I talked a little bit about means and standard deviations already. Probability, and that kind of goes in with combinatorics, counting questions, and that's what data analysis is, right? Counting questions. And a little bit of number theory, right? How to find remainders. What's the remainder if, you know, a certain number is divided by a prime number and so forth. So this is all the type of stuff that's under the umbrella of arithmetic. You also have to know algebra. In fact, the majority of what's tested on the math section comes down to algebra. Probably about half of the questions have algebra in some capacity, whether it's word problems, common word problems, simultaneous equations, learn the common quadratic equations that are on the GMAT, exponent rules, roots and radicals, simplifying algebraic equations. Now, algebra is one area when I get to part 2 and talk about strategy that you can most easily avoid. Right? And so algebra is an area where you really want to learn some of the non-standard strategies I'm going to talk about to turn otherwise complicated and difficult algebra questions into more easy, concrete, normal kind of word problems. But I'll get there. And then geometry. The third component is geometry. And honestly, it's basic geometry, right? This stuff isn't rocket science. You don't have to do any proofs. But parallel lines, triangles, especially triangles, are the most commonly tested geometric figure. Quadrilateral circles, they love circles. And then a little bit of coordinate geometry as well. Right? So this is the content you need for the quantitative section of the GMAT. Now, where do you get some of this stuff? I'm going to recommend some books. Obviously, my courses and a la carte videos, books are a great thing to go. The other resource I give a lot of my students or people who email me, if you're not familiar with the Khan Academy, I think it's .com, it might be .org. Just Google it. I mean, it's one of the most popular websites on the web these days. They have all sorts of free videos on different topics. So if you forget how to multiply and divide fractions, just go there, right? They don't really have GMAT-specific stuff, and they're not going to teach you how to do data sufficiency or some of the harder GMAT questions, but you can beef up. If you feel like you really need to beef up on some basic math, Khan Academy has some great free resources. Now, on the verbal side, you're going to need to know English grammar because sentence corrections are all about English grammar. And the major areas to make sure you know the core rules of are the subject-verb agreement, pronoun rules, modifiers, parallelism, idioms, and then verb tenses. Now, you're also going to have to know how to analyze arguments. And remember, earlier I said this isn't important not just for the critical reasoning section, but also for writing that essay. And a lot of students kind of think, oh, I just need to be smart. I just need to kind of think through the logic of this question. But if you can learn the core parts of an argument, premises, conclusions, how to find assumptions, that will help you answer these questions because most of the critical reasoning questions go back to your ability to identify assumptions. So spend time learning how to do that, and then read some more after that, and then read some more before you go to bed, and then read again when you wake up in the morning, right? Ultimately, there are some things I can teach you, for example, about how to improve your reading comprehension, but at the end of the day, there's no substitute for reading. It's going to help you across the board on the verbal section of the GMAT, and it's not too early to start. Now, you don't want to go out and read trashy romance novels, right? We need to read some stuff that's got some meat to it. So I actually have an article on my blog. If you just go to dominatethegmat.com/blog, maybe just type in something like suggested reading list or something like that. You should be able to find it. If not, I can well, you can email me and I can send it to you if you can't find it. But I got a list of some of my recommendations that I give my students for what they should read. But things like National Geographic, Scientific America, the Wall Street Journal, right? Things that are going to have the types of articles and things that you may see on the GMAT. And then obviously there's no substitute for actual formal reading comprehension passages, which you're going to get in the official guide for GMAT review, which I'll talk about later. All right. So from a content standpoint, that's what you're in store for. Now, I obviously don't have the time in a 1-hour webinar to teach you all that content. I mean, I got a course where I got 20-plus hours of content teaching you all of that stuff. You're going to have to put in the time to learn the content, but that's what you need to do. Now, where can you focus? You can get more bang for your buck in certain areas, right? Sentence correction is huge. You can make the biggest strides generally. I'm just talking in general terms. Most of my students make the biggest improvements on the verbal section in the area of sentence corrections. It's where you tend to have the most control, the most tangible things that you can learn to boost your score. So if you have a limited amount of time, focus on sentence corrections. Also learn to master the non-traditional math strategies. I'm going to talk about that in part 2. I talked earlier about the format and how really that math and verbal section is going to be more worth your time than studying the essays and integrated reasoning. Why? Well, because everything that you're studying for math and verbal applies to the essays and integrated reasoning anyway, and the score is more important. And then focus on some of the high-tested content areas. I mentioned the fact that triangles, for example, are the most commonly tested geometric figure. So make sure you know those forwards and backwards. And if you're not quite as good at solid geometry, yeah, that's all right. You might see one question. So what if you get it wrong, right? You can still get a good score. But if you don't know how to do triangles, you might be in a world of hurt, right? Learn the common word problems, focus on the common data sufficiency questions, and so forth. And then, like I said, read, and read some more. All right, let's switch gears to part 2 of your game plan. And this comes down to getting right answers more effectively, more efficiently, right? This isn't just learning how to read the notes on the piano page. It's learning how to improvise. It's learning how to more efficiently play the piece that you're looking at. And you need to learn to do that on the GMAT, all right? On the verbal section, there are 2 key, what I call non-traditional math strategies. Not everybody teaches them. They're not in all the textbooks. But for me, I call them working backwards and making up numbers, right? The idea is this, guys. You want to make the GMAT easier. You don't always want to play by their rules. And a lot of times what they do is they'll give you an algebra question, for example, that maybe has a bunch of variables in it, right? If a printing press makes X, it prints X papers in Y hours, how many papers will it print if blah, 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 right? Well, what a nightmare, right? They give you X's, they give you Y's. The answer choices have X's and Y's in them, and it's like, oh my gosh, you feel like poking your eyes out. Well, what if we make it a lot easier? What if we work with real numbers, right? It's not rocket science. I'm not teaching you some crazy thing that I'm the only one in the world who's thought up, but it just makes sense, doesn't it? That if we make up numbers for X and make up numbers for Y and turn an otherwise esoteric question into a concrete question, now we're not playing by their rules, and we can make it a lot easier. And I think one of the traps that a lot of students fall into is they try to solve algebra questions or geometry or math questions in general on the GMAT in the traditional textbook way, and that will kill you, right? You're simply not going to do as well on the GMAT if you try to do everything the traditional way that your high school algebra teacher would have been proud of you for doing and showing all your work and all that stuff. It's a means to an end. Your job is to get right answers, so do things that help you get right answers. And making up numbers is one of those strategies. Working backwards, I actually teach in detail in my free session that you can get on my website. So if you go to dominatethegmat.com, there's a button at the top that says free session. If you just download that free session, I actually teach this working backwards strategy in detail. But I would say if you're going to spend time as part of your GMAT prep learning some strategies, those would be the 2 places to start. Now, you also need to learn how to systematically work problems and eliminate clearly wrong answer choices, right? The other thing you need to get good at doing is improving your guessing odds, because you're not going to be able to answer every single question on the GMAT. Remember how it works. They give you a harder question, then a harder question, then a harder question, then a harder question, until eventually they give you a question so hard, no matter how good you are, you're just not going to be able to get it right. I mean, people who even get an 800 still get a couple of questions wrong on the GMAT. So at some point, you're going to get something wrong. But what do you do when you don't quite know how to answer a question? Well, you need to master the art of finding oddball answers, eliminating clearly wrong answer choices, and maybe improving your guessing odds to, say, 50-50, learning to use logic and common sense. All right? And then there's the whole realm of strategies around figures. Now, I don't have time to teach them all here, obviously, but figures are interesting on the GMAT. Now, on the problem-solving section, figures are assumed drawn to scale unless otherwise indicated, and we can use that to our advantage. On the data sufficiency section, they're assumed not to be drawn to scale unless otherwise indicated, and we can use that to our advantage. There are ways to manipulate the figures, to do things with the figures to improve your ability to get right answers, and these are the types of strategies and the thinking that you need to learn. And so what I want to do, and this is what I want to teach you this here. I said for those of you who have already taken the GMAT, I wanted to teach you some things that are going to be really value added. And I think this is a really cool strategy. So here's what I want you to do. I want you all to take a look at this question and just give it a try for like 15 seconds, 30 seconds, see if you would know how to do it. Now, ordinarily, you would have about 2 minutes to answer a question like this, again, on the GMAT. 75 minutes to do 37 questions. That works out to about 2 minutes a question, about 1:45. But what would you do on a question like this, right? So in a circle below, PQ is parallel to the diameter OR. OR has a length of 18, so on your scratch paper, you would want to kind of write some of this stuff in. What is the length of minor arc PQ? So let me just kind of draw that in blue. They're asking for that length. How do you do this? And some of you guys, if you're working on it, you can go ahead and type your answer in the chat area if you want. Let's give you another second to look at it. Now here's the reality. Some of you, we have a lot of people on this call actually. Statistically, you know, a large percentage of you guys, especially if you haven't taken the GMAT yet, are going to be looking at this and have no clue. I mean, you just haven't done circles in forever. You barely remember what a minor arc is. You forget what pi even stands for. Pi is about 3.14, right? You simply haven't learned the content yet. You don't know. Oh, go ahead.
We are getting answers. We are getting answers in the question window. But I always thought pie was a certain kind of dessert.
Yeah, there, exactly. Pi Day is that thing that rolls around on Facebook and everybody puts those pretty pictures of pies up on your screen.
Strawberry sounds good.
All right. Actually, so we have one person who has put the correct answer down. Vince, congratulations. I won't say what your answer is yet. Anastasia has an answer. So, yeah, we have a couple of different answers coming in. One person thinks 3 pi. All right. Here's my point. And this is the thinking. This is what I need to train you to do. I need to train you to start thinking like you want to get right answers no matter what, even if you don't know how to do the math. And how might we do it? Given the fact that I just told you that the figures are drawn to scale. You have this as a key. They have told you that OR is 18, right? I mean, if you had a map of the United States and you were driving from Washington, D.C. to Boston, and you had the little scale in the bottom of your map, you can kind of hold it up to the map and figure out roughly how far it is from Washington, D.C. to Boston. Could you do the same thing here? Yes, absolutely. I want you literally to take your scratch paper on test day, right? You got your scratch paper on test day. I want you to hold it up to the computer screen. People are going to think you're crazy, but that's okay. Nobody's going to be looking. And I want you to make a little tick mark on your scratch paper, right, for the length of PQ and say, okay, that's the length of PQ. And then I want you to hold it up down here and compare it to OR. And it's drawn to scale. So here's what you're going to see. Okay, there's one little PQ distance. Here's another little PQ distance. Hey, look at that. About 3 PQs are going to fit inside OR. Does that make sense? Can you see kind of the thinking? Guys, your job is to get right answers. I don't care if you don't know how to do circles yet. Right? There are some questions that this strategy won't work for. You have to learn some things about circles. But if it works, go with it. You need to start to outthink the test makers, right? Because arc PQ is about the same length as line segment, chord PQ, right? It might be a touch longer because it's not a straight line. But if I put a gun to your head and I said, about how big is PQ? Well, you'd say it's about 6. Why? Well, because 3 of those are going to fit inside the diameter because I held a piece of paper up to my computer screen and I just figured that out, right? Logic tells me it's going to be about 6. Well, what does pi equal? Pi equals 3.14. So what's answer choice A? About 6. Now, B is close, right? 27 divided by 4, it's a little bit, or sorry, 36 divided by 4, it's a little bit bigger, right? It's closer to 7. But then these are completely out of the running. 3 times 3 is 9. PQ is definitely less than halfway. I mean, again, they're drawn to scale, so if you actually held your piece of paper up to the computer screen, you'd eliminate E, you'd eliminate D, you'd eliminate C. Maybe you don't feel comfortable eliminating B yet because it's kind of close, between 6 and 7, but at least you've improved your guessing odds. And if you really did a good job on your scratch paper, you can actually get the right answer without even knowing how to do the math. Does this make sense? This is what I mean by strategy. And this is the way that I want you to start to think. I want you to avoid doing algebra if you can by making up numbers, by working backwards. I want you to use figures to your advantage. Why? Because you can get right answers more effectively, more efficiently, and faster. All right. I think I've kind of beaten this horse to death, but I hope you see this as valuable. Keep it in your back pocket because it will absolutely help you. Now, let's wrap things up by talking about that third component of dominating anything, including the GMAT, which comes back to practice. And here's what you need to do. At the end of the day, there's no substitute for working lots and lots and lots of practice problems. I ultimately say that your ability to do – the GMAT is basically a test of pattern recognition, right? Pattern recognition. How quickly can you see a question pop up on your screen and identify what you're looking at and say, I've seen that before. This is a mixture problem, a dry mixture problem. I've seen this before. This is a subject-verb agreement issue. I can use the bracketing technique. I've seen this before. This is a strengthening arguments question. I know how to find the assumption because it's a causal argument. I know what the assumption is, so I know how to strengthen this argument, right? The GMAT is an exercise in pattern recognition. The more you have seen before test day, the more likely you are to recognize the questions as they pop up on your screen and know how to answer them. That's it, as simple as that. Real former GMAT problems are the best. And I'm going to tell you which book to get to make sure that you have those real former GMAT questions. And then the other thing about working lots of practice problems is you want to develop that mental stamina. And when you're taking your full-length practice test, right, it's one thing to just work practice problems on your own where you have 20 minutes to learn the content and all that and get them right. But eventually you need to develop your time management, so you need to practice under test day conditions, to train that internal clock, right, to learn when to cut your losses, so that you can really practice those end-of-section strategies I was talking about earlier to make sure you're not completely running out of time, to make sure that you don't get hit with those penalties, and to make sure that you're in the best position to get as many right answers as possible. In terms of practice tests, there are 2 available at MBA.com, and I actually need to modify this slide. There are now 2 free ones available at MBA.com, but I believe they have 5 total because they're selling them now, so they have a few more available for sale at MBA.com as well. And then I actually sell some on my website at a very reasonable price as well if you're looking for practice tests. So definitely practice, 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 and work on your weaknesses. Think about what I talked about earlier, the big bang for your buck areas, right? What are the biggest areas to strengthen your overall score? Maybe it's sentence correction. Maybe it's working on triangles. Find those high-yield areas and really make sure that you get excellent at those. All right? So as we wrap things up, here are a few guides for you. I think we had some questions in here. I think Abhijit had some questions about recommending resources for non-standard math techniques, Abhijit. Like I said, I think my free session teaches that make-up numbers strategy perfectly. I actually have an a la carte lesson for only $25 that teaches all of the non-standard techniques, and so there's some different resources. And then I think some of the Manhattan GMAT books probably touch on some of that stuff as well. Here are my recommended resources, though, in general for studying for the GMAT. The two books I like, kind of the non-negotiable, is the Game Plan, the GMAT Review Official Guide 2015. You see a picture of it here. This is the definitive book. I don't get any royalties on this, guys. I'm not recommending it because I get kickbacks. It just is the only book out there made by the makers of the GMAT with real former GMAT questions. I mean, it's the book that everybody has. And they also have a website affiliated with it where you can do integrated reasoning questions and all of that type of stuff. So it's key. You got to have that book. The other book I use in my course with my students is called Game Plan for the GMAT. I like it because it's not heavy on instruction. It's just a lot of good practice questions that are broken down into the most commonly tested types. There's not a lot of fluff. Like, people ask me all the time about Manhattan GMAT and their books and things like that. I think they're great books, but I think they're very academic. I think they teach a lot of things just for the sake of teaching you lots of cool stuff to make sure they got a bunch of books. Again, I'm not bashing Manhattan GMAT. I have friends over at Manhattan GMAT. I even own their books. I love their books. I think they're great books. But at the end of the day, if your job is to get right answers, focus on the most commonly tested questions, and that's what the Game Plan for the GMAT does. It's basically just a book full of the most common questions that you're going to see of all question types. I've got a bunch of good content on my blog. In terms of your time commitment, you got to put in the time. I've got an article up on my blog with some statistics from the GMAC that students who crack 600 on average are studying about 100 hours. So that's kind of the target. That's the number you're shooting for, right? Some of you can get there faster in fewer hours. Some of you might need a little bit more time than that. But for me, for example, my course is 8 weeks long. It's kind of designed around an 8-week syllabus, 6 to 10 hours a week. This is kind of, it's a process. You're not going to get good at playing the piano or speaking a language overnight. You got to put in the time. You got to do the practice. And this is really the commitment it's going to take. Probably a good 2 to 3 months. You can crash course it a little bit, especially for some of you who have already taken the GMAT, but be willing to put in the time. And the other thing I say is consistency. It's better to do a little bit every day than it is to just spend 8 hours on a Saturday, right? It's the same thing as going to the gym. Are you going to get better results going to the gym 30 minutes a day or once on Saturday for 3 hours? Right? You're going to get a lot better results if you do something every single day than if you just go into the gym once, and the same thing applies on the GMAT. All right. Now, as we wrap things up, I did mention some special promotions. I am offering, just for those of you on this webinar, a special discount, 12% off, $48 off my full course. And I actually created a very special link. Like I said, this is just for you guys, a special link on my website that you can go to at www.dominatethegmat.com/accepted. Very easy to remember. If you don't, maybe Linda or somebody, you can type it in the chat area or something if you wanted to, but it should be pretty easy to remember. If you forget it, you can email me, you can call me. Here's my contact information. Feel free to reach out personally. And then I know some of you guys are listening to this on the recording. If you're listening to this on the recording, and you've missed this deadline, I'm really only running this for a few days. I'm going to make the link inactive on Sunday night at midnight Pacific time. But if you've missed that deadline and you're listening to this on the recording, because I know Linda's going to put it up on the website, send me an email and we'll see what we can do to work with you. Now, I know a lot of you have stuck around to the bitter end because you want to win one of these free practice tests. So here's how you do that. Very simple. Go to my Facebook page. Like it if you want to. You don't have to do that to win the test, but would appreciate it. But just leave a comment. The very first post you'll see, the most current post, is about this webinar. You'll see the graphic that Linda put together about this webinar, and I simply want you to leave a comment. Just tell me the biggest thing you learned, or just say thank you for the webinar. Just say hi. Just leave a comment down there. And what I'll do is, in a couple of days, I'll draw out of a hat the names of everybody who left a comment in the Facebook area. I'll pull 3 names out of that hat. I'll contact you via Facebook, and I'll send you your free practice test. So that's it. I appreciate it. Linda, thank you for the opportunity to be on here. I hope you guys found it valuable. Here's my contact information. Don't be shy about reaching out to me personally to let me know how I can help serve you. Linda, back to you.
Great. Thank you, Brett, so much. This was amazing. I've heard other GMAT prep webinars, and this was really fantastic, both for the overview and just the very practical approach that you provide. There are several questions in the question window. We're not going to get to all, but there was one very interesting one that I saw from Jitesh, who asks, does the score at the end of the quant section affect the beginning of the verbal section? You were saying how it's computer adaptive. I assume that's within the section. When you start the new section, do you get a fresh start?
Yeah, it is. You do get a fresh start on the verbal section. Very good question. Now, somehow their algorithms combine them all at the very end because you only get one score for both the quant and verbal, but it's not like if you have completely dominated the quantitative section that now you're going to get a super hard question as the very first verbal question. Good question.
Yeah, that was a really good question. Let me see. We're just about at the end. And let me ask another question. Yen asks, can I leave some questions blank in the verbal section at the end of the session when I run out of time? I think you were kind of advising against that, and that would be true in the verbal as well as in the quant. Is that correct, or do you want to address your question?
That's correct. Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Don't, on either section, don't leave any blank. It doesn't matter whether you're at the end of the quant section or the end of the verbal section, don't leave any blanks. So make sure you have enough time. If you got like 15 seconds left and a couple left, start blindly clicking answers, because even if you get them wrong, you need to make sure you get them submitted before time runs out.
Okay, great. All right, well, with that, I think we've got to most of the questions. I'm sure if you have additional questions, you can either pose them on Brett's blog, our blog, Dominate the GMAT's Facebook page, our Facebook page, and if it's on our site, then we'll be happy to ask Brett to answer them, and I'm sure he'd be more than happy to do so. And I want to thank Brett again, Dominate the GMAT's founder, for sharing with us his secrets for cowing the GMAT. We're going to take your question. Well, we just did take your questions, but again, Brett is offering $48 off his full course through Sunday, you said, right, Brett? Through Sunday?
That's right, through Sunday.
Okay, so
that's correct.
Head on over to his site. You can really save some money on a fantastic option there. Secondly, I want to remind you that the GMAT is an important step on the way to business school, but it's not the last one. As Brett said at the very beginning, go to him at this point, come to Accepted once you get your GMAT score for help with choosing schools, presenting yourself effectively, compellingly in your application, your essays, your short answers, your resume, everything that comes after the GMAT. That's really what we help with. So if you would like one-on-one assistance with selecting the right schools for you, handling weaknesses, telling your story, or preparing for interviews, please check out Accepted's admissions consulting at www.accepted.com/services/mbaservices.aspx. I put the URL up in the chat window. And if you're not quite ready for that one-on-one assistance, then we have tons of free resources at www.accepted.com/MBA. And we're also going to be hosting a webinar next month on how to get accepted in 2016. We will not cover GMAT prep. That's definitely not my thing. But we'll cover a lot of other things. Actually, I think it's the 7 steps you need to do, something like that, to get accepted in 2016. And it will cover, as I said, everything but GMAT prep. So look forward to seeing you there. And thank you very much for attending again. And I'm going to